have some backups ready. But that being said, I highly encourage everyone to time themselves. And I will be putting the timestamps on the chat just so we can reconvene if, let's say, I get disconnected or anyone gets disconnected. Hopefully, it doesn't happen though. Secondly, I guess everyone already did the introduction, but feel free to do that again before you deliver your speech. I guess no POI, so we can just start with start. Welcome to the Filipino Grand Slam Open, I guess. In that case, debating on the motion that Western states should support local rebel groups by funding, e.g., by funding them and giving them intel, as opposed to direct military intervention in other states. To start, I call upon the first affirmative speaker, here.
All right. Am I audible? All right. So just to reiterate, gender pronouns he, they. Starting my speech in a bit. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The classic tale of military interventions goes as follows. Oftentimes, they become constrained because of domestic political will that prevents them from sending the right operations, and even then, it oftentimes leads to the bloodiest conflicts. Those such as in Saudi Arabia, where you got direct intervention but killing millions of individuals, in Yemen rather, or in places such as Sudan or Afghanistan. What exactly is the comparative that we support? So we think that in areas of significant civil strife, ones where there needs to be some form of military operation there, in placement of direct intervention, i.e. setting up boots in the ground, sending your tanks and armies there, we would want to fund local rebel groups in those areas, such as the Kurds and the Syrian civil army in those places, maybe in other places such as Sudan and Afghanistan, instead of sending our own troops there. I just want to make something very clear here that local rebel groups are going to exist under either side. The difference is whether or not they're going to be supported by Western forces, right? We think that the team that wins the debate is the team that proves where you're able to minimize the amount of casualty possible, while at the same time trying to make a military intervention that's sustainable, that helps the better will of all those citizens that are in danger. Two arguments. First, why you get more sustainable military interventions under our side? 4 reasons. One, we think that the problem is that oftentimes there is difficulty on the ends of the Western forces to create and start the direct military intervention because there's a lot of domestic hesitancy for whether or not they want to start the war mission in the first place. This is precisely what happened in Mali, for instance, because the French weren't able to intervene in time, and as a result, they could have done something within the interim period. The second problem that exists in a lot of cases is that, again, they're limited by the risk aversion of a lot of citizens. That is to say that they cannot fully do specific military operations because of the fear of citizens dying. This is precisely what happened in places such as Sudan, where once you got the Battle of Mogadishu, we think that the American forces under the Bill Clinton administration had to pull out because they saw body bags being thrown through the street, making it impossible. How exactly are we able to solve these two specific problems? Because we think that under our side, in a world where you fund a lot of rebel groups, you don't need specifically the consent of a lot of these citizens. So you bypass a lot of the bureaucracy of having to enter into debates and having to convince your own domestic population as the West, to convince US citizens, to convince French citizens to want to enter into the war to begin with. But second of all, you remove their risk aversion once they know that they're not specifically expending their own troops in the first place, that it is some other rebel group, not the death of your own US citizens. The second reason why you get more sustainable military interventions under our side is because we think that the problem with a lot of Western military interventions is that it becomes specifically hard for you to do specific peacekeeping operations in instances where you need to protect particular economic assets. What do I mean by this? We think that the problem in a lot of areas is that whenever you're participating in a military intervention, you're not always going on the offensive. Oftentimes, you need to do defensive strategies of protecting things like oil fields, for instance, in Iraq. But you think that the problem is that the West could not enter there because they would have been perceived as a selfish actor that wanted to be there to extract oil in those places. The difference is that when you're able to fund a local rebel group in these regions, you're less likely to face a specific form of international demonization because they're perceived as protecting their own places versus being perceived as an actor that is attempting to steal a lot of the economic assets in those regions, right? Which means that they're able to create a diversity of military operations under our side that are able to defend specific economic assets that they need, right? Take note that a lot of the oil fields in Iraq were essential for the goods and services that are needed to survive in these regions or for a lot of citizens, but they aren't able to protect that under their side. But the last reason why we're able to have more sustainable military interventions is just based on geographic constraints and the fact that it's going to be a lot more expensive. Because oftentimes it is very difficult for you to send troops all the way from millions of miles away to places like Syria or in the Middle East, versus us being able to directly give them the funds where you're able to bypass a lot of the fixed costs in terms of transporting a lot of your troops there. The time lag, which could have saved millions of lives as a result of them, for instance, dying from terrorist organizations in the first place. I want to note that this specific argument wins the debate outright, right? Because the problem in a lot of military interventions is that they tend to be unsustainable, they tend to be really slow, but even when they try to work, the military operations cannot optimize for the best possible tactics, given that they have to account for the specific ways how the public is going to react, which means that you cannot engage in the best possible course of action within a lot of these regions. Moving on to the second argument to suggest why war is significantly less dangerous, and as a result, you minimize the amount of casualties under our side. 4 reasons to suggest this. First one, we think that the problem, mirroring of that of the first argument, there are perverse domestic pressures to want to end the war quickly. This is because when they know that when the public perceives the war to take a long period of time, then they're going to perceive that as more casualties being dead, right? And as a result, we think that there's a perverse incentive for a lot of Western states to want to engage in the most gratuitous forms of military operations that may not necessarily lead to the most optimal outcomes. Take a look at, for example, in the Obama administration, when they sent things like chemical weapons, for instance, or sent a lot of drone strikes, which often end up harming a lot of local villages and places within those regions that end up escalating conflict and innocent casualties as a result. The reason why funding rebel groups will not do this is because they are not forced to rush in time. They don't need to factor in the public under their side, which means that they are able to do it specifically at their own pace. But second of all, we think that they have an incentive to cater to local populations because that's their ability to get information. That's their way how they're going to be able to recruit a lot of people, right? Because they know that these are their own domestic citizens and they're unlikely to want to kill off these people in the name of some specific military operation that happens under their side. But the second reason why we think that oftentimes it leads to more casualties is because we think the West is oftentimes perceived as a polarizing force. Oftentimes the West has a tendency to antagonize local populations because it's the white man trying to save the people of Syria or the people within the Middle East. And oftentimes you're able to create a lot of brainwashing on the ends of that authoritarian government trying to convince people and say that they're the enemy, right? And the fact that they don't speak that local language. The difference is under our side is that a lot of these local rebel groups have the capacity to work with a lot of these local communities and understand their specific interests, right? Which removes the antagonization that happens as a result of many of these bloody wars, which oftentimes leads to more enemies that exist coming from their side. But the last reason to suggest why we think that it's better is because the post-war efforts are more likely to be successful, right? Because let's take the best case coming from their side, where they're able to depose a leader, for instance, or able to wipe out a terrorist organization. The problem is that oftentimes the transition to power and stability is incredibly harmful. Take a look at what happened in Iraq. After deposing Saddam Hussein, there's a massive power struggle that existed in those regions because they weren't able to successfully impose some power structure in the first place, right? The difference is that under our side, when we're able to fund a specific rebel group, we're able to immediately remove the power vacuum. Take note, as I mentioned earlier in the framing, there are going to be local rebel groups that will exist on both sides of the house. Both sides want power. Both sides want to have some form of political representation. But oftentimes that leads to relapses of conflict insofar as they're trying to get that power grab. Under our side, the West is specifically able to select winners that prevents any flare-up of conflict of different clans or different rebels fighting against each other, leading to the local infighting that oftentimes leads to the next war in the first place, right? The last reason to suggest why this better is because we're able to minimize also proxy wars, because oftentimes the escalation comes from the fact that there's a clear foreign actor participating. Once we're able to obscure that because it's a local rebel group participating, it prevents oftentimes a lot of these states like Iraq trying to solicit support from China or Russia because they're saying that the West is out to get us, right? Versus under our side where it's an internal conflict where you're less able to justify that. I just want to note, a lot of these local rebel groups have the capacity to help a lot of these regions, right? They will have the intel information and the classified knowledge that they get from the CIA. They will get a lot of the techno muscles needed for war, such as guns, tanks, all needed for you to succeed in that war to make sure that you have better military operations. But the difference is that you don't have the constraint. They have all the capacity being supported by the West, but the difference is that you're more likely to win it, and insofar as you're more sustainable and lead to less casualties. For those reasons, affirm.
All right, I think the first affirmative speaker. Wait, sorry. All right, I guess we can proceed. I call upon the first negative speaker.
Hello, can I be heard? Okay. Focus on me, not Ali. Okay. So I can be heard. Start my speech in 3, 2, and 1.
Supporting rebel groups has and always will continue to lead to making the conflict worse, to intensifying hostilities and make it a forever war. Direct military intervention both is more accountable because it has a higher barrier to entry and faces more international condemnation. And two, it is more effective at solving the problem. Whether we do nothing because we don't intervene in the first place because there are higher barriers to, or because we do directly intervene in the most important cases. There are many examples of success for us on opposition, like the NATO intervention in Bosnia or the UN mission in Sudan. The examples they point out that are apparently bad for us, like Saudi Arabia, are caused because they bankrolled the Saudi army and various rebel groups in Yemen to protect American oil fields. It is not the case that their side solves their problems because they continue to select the worst groups and they continue to make them worse. I have two responses to their case. The first is to their broad line of argumentation that there is some domestic hesitancy and people die. The problem is that they say interventions increase, but the issue is that they never prove these
Can someone pause the
Hello, can I be heard? Or am I
Hello,
still
yeah.
All right,
that's
that's
my
a-
problem. It
That's a little bit
happens to everyone.
Yeah. Do you mind if
Okay.
I just lost track of where I was?
Yep.
All right.
Go ahead. Just
I'm gonna have to repeat the whole intro again. Whatever. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. When you fund a rebel group, unlike this speech, there are no redos. You send those guns off into the wild, you'll never get them back. You have the Mujahideen, the Taliban pipeline, where once it was initially bankrolled by the West, but after you leave them behind, they become far out of your control and they become much worse. Two responses in this speech. The first response is towards their broad case that generally speaking, you have more interventions. Their failure here is to prove that having more interventions is good, when the whole tipping point they changed is that these interventions are less and less accountable, which means typically now they have to care less about what citizens want. Now they have to care less about what international communities and the international community wants. This tends to be bad because the default set of incentives states are operating on without these counterbalances tend to be very bad because they tend to be bankrolled by the military industrial complex, by selling arms to these people, by funding oligarchs to make money from them, by protecting your local oil fields. These are bad and they tend to destabilize local states, like many of the examples they bring up, which means you have way more bad interventions, where the aim is not to solve the conflict, but to actively make it worse because they profit from it. So maybe Gov is correct that they have some more interventions, but they never prove that these interventions are any good. And the second thing is that they have prospectively good interventions turn bad because they lose accountability on these actors for many of the reasons government mentions, that now the international community doesn't listen to them anymore. Which means at the end of Gov's first argument, they're losing because they don't understand that the reason why states only intervene when the need is sufficiently high is because you have to be very precise and very careful about which interventions, because they can often have the potential to be much worse than doing nothing. Which leads me to the second response, which is they say there's a pressure to end the war more quickly on when you have a direct military intervention. The first thing I'll observe is that this is good, right? Doing war crimes tends to radicalize people on the ground and tends to prolong the conflict, which means Western states have an incentive to abide by international agreements and treaties, particularly because of all the reasons that they give that citizens will get quite mad, especially if they think it's a farce, and the international community will hate you, which means Western states have an obligation to not only make their people happy, which means that they're less likely to do bad things, but secondly is that if they were only self-interested, they would still do it quickly and well because the fact that they have an incentive not to do war crimes because that would make the war be prolonged. The third and final thing is I'll observe that when they say, oh, there's anti-Western sentiment because now it's the West going into the country, imagine how much worse it is on government bench when you can point to any potential political rival and say they are funded by the West because look at these groups that were funded by the West before in the past, which means that in reality they can label anyone a potential political dissident and you actually have conflicts increase because the fact that they can use this as a label to slander you, which means that the anti-Western sentiment still remains, but now it's used increasingly as a tool to suppress and oppress dissent. Let's move now to the first argument. So I want to point out that the tipping point in this debate is correctly identified by Gov, but unstrategically taken, which is that supporting local rebel groups is worse than doing nothing, and the burden to entry in terms of actually directly intervening is much higher, which means for some of the cases, or for many of the cases, Gov does intervene and sends money to these rebel groups, and Op does nothing. In this case, we will show that Gov is substantially worse. Number one, I will observe that government shows adverse selection for the worst rebel groups possible. So they're not picking the nice median rebel group, but they tend to pick the worst ones, which is, as Gov says, they pick the winners. Why? Number one, the groups that are most likely to be aligned with Western interests tend to be radical because they seek radical goals like statehood, independent of the previous state, for example, which tend to be more in line with the West and hence be more willing to use violent ends. Number two is that they tend to be the ones that get attention, which means the most successful groups are the ones most sensationalized and catch the attention of people, which means they're the ones most likely to use violent means. They're the ones most likely to promise outlandish goals that they now have to meet by, for example, eradicating a particular race. But number three is that they tend to be the least accountable because, as Gov correctly points out, the most powerful rebel groups are the ones they will select, but these most powerful rebel groups are the ones least aligned or least have an incentive to listen to the West and become moderate if government really wants that, which just means they tend to pick the rebel groups that themselves commit active war crimes. A little bit of weighing here. Just because Gov does something doesn't mean they do something good. And in reality, if you're only empowering actors that will continue to do atrocities and continue to hurt other people, then it's actively a harm. The second thing, though, is funding rebel groups doesn't just pick bad rebel groups. It also makes the rebel groups worse in two ways. First, it makes the people you fund worse because, one, by giving them funds, they're now no longer beholden to public support, so they don't have to care about the people do on the ground, which means you can bankroll them, you can bankroll their efforts with the money and Western guns, which means they don't have an incentive to care about what citizens on the ground think anymore, which means they can continue to freely oppress them. Number two is because you embolden them to be more aggressive, now because they no longer suffer, for example, reputation hits because they can blame the West, saying that the West did it, the West bankrolled our bombs, and beyond that, now they have an even stronger incentive because they want to show that they can succeed, which means they're more likely to do large terror attacks. And number three is because they can consolidate power and crush other rebel groups, which is now their incentive so that there's no one else competing with them. Which means the first thing is that you make the rebel groups you fund much worse. But number two is that the people you don't fund, that is to say, the ones that are left behind, tend to get worse. All of government's points about soliciting Western, non-Western actors for money gets even worse on their side when non-Western actors see you as trying to repetitiously get control over a particular region. So now you also get money from China, for example, from Russia. You get Russian guns and Russian funding, which substantially worsens the conflict because while neither side is making marginal gains, the total amount of guns and violence increases because they have both the funding and the capacity to do so, which means they don't actually make any meaningful progress in the direction of peace. They do make meaningful the direction of increasing the amount of violence. So the second is that you make both your rebel groups and other rebel groups much worse. The third and final thing is you make the state itself worse. The first thing is that now they're much more willing and pliable to target civilians because any one of them could be funded by the West. Now civilians become an active target of military violence, like in the situations that they mentioned, where they're more willing to do, like, for example, the Syrian government using gas bombs on their own civilians because they could potentially be beneficiaries of Western funding. But secondly is that they're also much more likely to do other things that are draconian that make things worse for people on the ground, like restricting access with Western nations or rejecting Western aid, which could be unambiguously good, but because they see any Western funding as a prospective threat rather than them being relatively neutral, you are now much more aligned against them. But thirdly is that they themselves become much more belligerent. The conclusion of this first argument is quite simply, number one, government doesn't solve the problem. They heighten and intensify these atrocities. Number two is that they are a hindrance to peace building both now and forever into the future because now you have hundreds of free-flowing arms and munitions even after the state is stabilized and fixed, which means the conflict could start up at any point in the future. And number three is you worsen the arms race by creating a proxy conflict become the race to the bottom, which means government doesn't fix a conflict, they make it worse. Argument two, our alternative is better. The first thing to show is that less interventions and more precise interventions are better. So the first thing is, if there are no interventions, then the war will end much more quickly, since without free-flowing arms and free-flowing money, they are much more willing to lose the will to fight and are much more willing to come to a ceasefire in the first place, which means they're more willing to compromise and they're forced to trust each other. So the first thing is that the war just ends more quickly, which means even if Gov prospectively can make the fight last longer and have like a 2 or 5% more chance of winning, if that extra 5 years means thousands of people more die, that's simply not worth it than the prospective chance of an uneasy peace that we get in opposition. Number two is that if the authoritarian regime wins versus the war continuing for longer, then we're able to provide basic services for people because authoritarian states have an incentive to do that. But in a situation where it's all-out conflict, authoritarian states and rebel groups can't provide for people on the ground because they have to spend their money on the war effort, which means people on Gov still starve even if the war continues for the better. And number three is that even if rebels win, it's much better for our side because it's out of emergent popular support and the resulting state has much more legitimacy than it would be the case if it were entirely funded and propped up by the West. The second and final thing I'm going to argue is that the direct interventions themselves are much better. One, because the remaining democratic interventions are ones where it's self-selecting into the best interventions. That is, in situations where it's particularly egregious, like the genocides in Bosnia, like the examples we give about the UN mission in Somalia, right? And in these instances, one, we're much more likely to actually win the engagements because government proves that they can have engagements, not that they will win. So the issue is that we have massive amounts of technological superiority. They can't even see the missiles that we're firing at them. We can fund these wars for much longer. Number two is that we also have control of the arms flow because we're much more accountable in where guns are going, which means we're unlikely to send, for example, guns to our enemies by accident, for example. And number three, this means that the peace building process is much more likely to be sustainable. One, because you came in with the explicit purpose of ending the war for a very egregious mean, because this was what was able to cross the threshold of the tipping point in the first place, which means you have instances like Japan or Germany where you actually stay for the entire peace building process rather than a government where they could still potentially leave ever having met that goal. But also finally, because you have the backing of the Western military that allows for private investment to flow in because they trust the state, because the state is strong, can hold actual free elections rather than having a rebel group or a rebel state that could potentially still fail. At the end of the speech, it is clear government fails to solve their problem. We do. That's why negative wins this debate.
All right, I thank the first negative speaker. I hope whatever happened earlier didn't happen again. So I would just go ahead and call upon the second affirmative speaker here.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Luigi. Preferred gender pronoun TMD. I'm going to start my speech in a minute, but I apologize for doing this, but I just want to make the most out of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Before I start my speech, I would like to thank my family. Shout out to my home Ateneo for the best community and people I could ever ask for in making me who I am. And finally, thank you to Miko and David, to whom I will always cheer on wherever your dreams and aspirations will take you in this world. And from my end, this is already a dream come true to be here against David. All right, let me start my speech. Starting in 3, 2, I don't want to cry. I'll start. All right. The militaries of Western governments are cursed by the strength of its might and the indecision of its leaders. We either expect too little from the military in the case of Libya, or we expect too much in the case of Afghanistan. In any case, these states were not made for US military bases, and the disease of boots on the ground continues to poison the prospects of these states in ways that constrain any aspiration and dream from bearing fruit. In any case, the dream of a quick and clean intervention is simply a lie. I'm going to argue one thing in today's speech. I'm going to argue why authoritarian rebel governments in the post-conflict are better than weak and fragile democracies led by US military forces. Because I would want to point out, when Negative tries to defend that we can have authoritarian stable governments at Negative, this is unlikely to be the case, especially when you're talking about a direct US military intervention with the direct intention of trying to usher in democratic forces and democratic transitions of government in the post-conflict. And that is why we think they make it worse. Before this, a few points of response. Number one, Negative claims that military interventions are largely hesitant, and they only do it on the best cases because there's a high barrier for entry. And I think this is a clear misunderstanding of the burden of this debate. They can't just say, oh, because there's a high barrier for entry, only we have to defend cases wherein it's very selective and very predictive and very targetive, while on our side, we fund all rebel groups that are always going to be volatile all the time because it's a lower barrier for entry. Presumably, we think these are cases wherein there will be a lot of intelligence to work with, wherein the governments can make these types of decisions very cleanly, like in the CIA. And I think this is not the case all the time. It's a false comparative. But even if that isn't the case, this is still not necessarily the case that you have a high barrier for entry. Our point from first speaker was that decision-making structures of government and the decisions of citizens can oftentimes lead to failed standards for when we should enter. This is why it was easy for Bush to convince the public to enter Iraq in the aftermath of 9/11, because there was significant popular support in the aftermath of thousands of people dying in a building. The same applies for the Vietnam War too, because people were easy to brainwash short-term on the threat of communism. And when the public realizes how bad the military is, then it is often too late. Or even when it is too late and we're trying to change the administration in an election, then it causes more uncertainty for boots on the ground, and therefore it's very hard for you to either decide to continue boots on the ground or soldiers to stay in these bases or to pull them out. And either case oftentimes causes more disruption, because by then most of these governments are heavily reliant on the US military, and thus any decision you would make either aggravates anti-Western sentiment or it makes it harder for you to cooperate with the Western government in the future. And both of these make it hard for any functional government to be supported. And that was the point of our first argument, because in either case, any functional governance is hindered. Number two, Negative claims that we failed to choose the best rebel groups. And I think these are exaggerations. It isn't likely we choose the best rebel groups, because some may actively be anti-Western and some may also be terrorists. So they're not always going to be the largest ones that are going to be killing everyone in the civilians. And we presumably agree that many of these rebel groups also have self-interest to take control of certain regions, take control of a certain territory against other cronies from the previous administration and against other existing government military forces who are also their comrades and allies and neighbors and all of these things. And therefore, there are incentives to mitigate the worst excesses of damage that would have otherwise been caused by the US military government or direct military intervention, because it's so much easier to target and say anyone from the Syrian army is an enemy of the US military and thus should be eliminated in this village, which causes more drone strikes to happen because there's more hesitancy to try and protect the lives of US military soldiers on the ground. That incentive structure is at least mitigated with rebel groups, because even if they're self-preserving, they care more approximately to the individual relationships with individuals, or at least different communities that they've grown up in for a very long time, which is why most ethnic tensions are diffused at most cases when you have rebel groups being the ones that lead these types of revolutions. The comparative they have to defend is that there's an existing disjunct between rebel groups already, and often the largest ones are the ones likely to take over in the next civil war and also are the ones most violent. And when you are directly antagonizing them, like in the case of direct military intervention, then it becomes harder for you to cooperate with any authoritarian government in the future, which is the worst part of their case. Because if you have an authoritarian government that is exactly anti-Western and anti-US military because of the prospect that you could threaten another intervention in the future or topple that government from power, then it becomes it becomes easier for them to justify getting funding from China and Russia. It becomes harder for you to justify another further US military intervention, increasing proxy wars, and thus making it harder to cooperate with any government. Again, the point is no functional governance, or at least a failed cooperative authoritarian government. Negative then claims that, worst case, direct military intervention, fast, less disruptive, and they have precise interventions like they're defending a clean and quick intervention. Two responses: this is unresponsive to our claim that the collateral damage is irreversible and the scale of this conflict is much worse with direct military intervention. Our point was the scale of conflict increases when you use the technology of the West and you continue to use it with boots on the ground being at stake and US military soldiers doing that, because it's easier for you to justify like having 100 less US soldiers dying compared to justifying at least we were able to solve the conflict even if 100,000 civilians died in this process. So it's inherently very difficult to be targeted because of the structures of the domestic US government compared to justifying more funding for rebel soldiers, which is easier for people to stomach in because it's going to be comparatively cheaper in some cases because you're only buying weapons, you're only buying some sort of anti-missile technology, etc., which is very easy for you to protect some rebel groups on the ground in the short to medium term and being able to gather up more critical mass. Authoritarian states are often the ones most hesitant to cooperate with the US military unless they are from a group that was from a pro-rebel cause. And this is exactly what happened with the uncertainty of General Pinochet's leadership in Chile, and this is why it's very hard for you to justify cooperation with them. So Negative's claims on stability are unfounded. Let me go to the argument on why authoritarian rebel governments are better than weak and fragile democracies led by US military forces. Why does direct military intervention lead to weak and fragile democracies? And I want to point out many US military interventions or Western interventions in general do have the intention, or at least some intention, that might be well-intentioned, to try and bring in democracy in the post-medium term, like the power sharing agreement of Afghanistan, or trying to bring in new individuals into parliament. Western military groups, even with good intentions, when they impose overly restricted democratic reforms, they cause too much administrative change that leads to long-term resentment. The example is the mistake in Iraq was that Paul Bremer imposed Order 1 to disband the Ba'ath Party and ban former members from any positions of authority, and Order 2, which disbanded the Iraqi military who became unemployed and eventually joined the insurgency. The structural reason behind this is that they fail to cooperate with existing cronies that have a lot of influence, whereas rebel groups are more likely to do so because their members are also involved with these crony groups and other economic forces because they're part of their families, they're part of their communities, and they also want to take over these state-owned enterprises. Number two, if not, then they impose a very low bar for democracy in the region, which allows the Western states to pull out, but really leads to a counterfeit democracy. The classic example of a counterfeit democracy is Afghanistan, where when they initiated the power sharing agreement, it easily failed and led to mass riots. And the point is, the structural reason behind this is that democracy cannot sustain itself outside of military intervention because it needs continuous involvement, or you leave it as a fake democracy and allow its leaders to run authoritarian regimes unchecked completely. The comparative with rebel groups is that even if they end up authoritarian in nature, they are better able to usher in significant economic growth and investment of its businesses due to it prioritizing the allies of the leading rebel group in power. So even in our worst case is Rwanda and Paul Kagame, because in the absence of military intervention after the Rwandan genocide, the National Democratic Institute and US aid were able to spend significant resources to incentivize the Kagame regime to extract millions of dollars in good governance and institute reforms like the Emihigo program to instill double-digit economic growth, which is the greatest turnaround in post-conflict history for any African nation. And this, like I will argue, even if Paul Kagame kills the other generals from other opposition groups, is comparatively a more preferable outcome than the uncertainty of US militaries trying to usher in democracy and the different post-conflict tensions that arise as a consequence of this. There are additional benefits to continued long-term cooperation, but I'll just say one right now here. Like, even cooperating with General Musharraf in Pakistan was able to allow us to get more intel to turn down other cells for Al-Qaeda. That's at least some benefit for stability. For these reasons, we don't believe in the dream of US intervention.
All right, I thank the second affirmative speaker. I call upon the second negative speaker.
Hello, can it be heard? All right, I'll set up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the strategy of Gov so far is to present a scattershot of examples to say, we succeeded in these instances and you failed in these instances. But if you step back and you take a look at the bigger picture, you'll begin to realize that the vast majority of modern terror and modern instability can directly be traced to the arms and training funded by the CIA, the groups such as the Mujahideen, etc. That is to suggest there are some very fundamental questions that government has failed to answer. Once you give them this arms and training, how do you know they will do anything that they suggest on Gov? What if they sell the arms immediately to another group? What if they use it to squash dissent so that you don't have another option? What if they use it to make sure that they can rule power with impunity and remove all of the democratic internalized incentives that they ultimately argue on Gov? The issue with them is that they're reliant on so much maybes that they're never really able to crack down on the individual reasons to why one group will do X or Y. The way that I will structure my speech is I'll talk about what changes on 5 levels. First of all, I'll talk about the decision to intervene. Second of all, I'll talk about the behavior of rebel groups. Third of all, I'll talk about the behavior of authoritarian states, the US government. Then finally, I'll talk about this worst case analogy of Luigi about a weak democracy versus an authoritarian rebel state. First of all, let's talk about the decision to intervene. And here I think government is ultimately the weakest. Luigi tries to par this debate by saying that, well, they have this weird retrospective analysis where on op you still support some degree of intervention. Therefore, you don't have this critique of us having less interventions. This is kind of ridiculous when the handle of Garcia's argument is that you get more interventions because Western states are more confident in intervening. And that specifically, the reasons why they give is that they are less accountable. There is no body bag effect. They don't need to justify their claims for civilians on the ground. And that ultimately, then the calculus changes towards the individual greed of politicians and the individual greeds of corporations. That is to suggest, while they might give a list of examples of good interventions versus bad interventions, the main deciding factor is the cause of interventions, to which we ultimately suggest that on Gov, you get into worse interventions in which you are more likely to be violent because you don't care about whether or not people will protest, and you can hide the fact that you're being violent because the democratic mechanisms of your own soldiers whistleblowing against your own army don't exist when it's some nebulous foreign rebel state that you have no capacity to have the degree of control over. That is to suggest, even if they're more successful, they don't beat the bare minimum burden that these are interventions that are good, especially if they give a wide array of examples of these interventions being bad. Let's deal with the second degree of change. They say that rebel groups are good, and their justification is that when you empower them, then the degree of change is that they become more powerful. We target their argumentation at the root. The root of their argument is that because rebel groups are from the democracy or from the state, they have things like family connections, cultural ties, etc., and therefore they're accountable. Our first criticism was to suggest is that you break this on Gov, which is to suggest that if the historical power base was your democratic legitimacy within this country and whether people like you, now you've got the US backing you up. Now you can just say, oh, look, I bombed these several regions, I protected these oil fields, I did everything that you want. It means that you actually remove the internal democratic incentive within these rebel groups and you replace it with an incentive that they even argue is significantly likely more to be benevolent. But I think the second thing that we highlight here is that they don't even deal with the internal degree of uncertainty, which is to suggest, how do you know that these rebel groups are going to do the things that they promise you? They say you have like some degree of US intelligence. Clearly, if the US was all powerful, we would win every single intervention and we would fight off every uncertainty. The fact of the matter is, if they are reliant with some degree of uncertainty, then presumably there is a large degree of chance in which after you fund them with all of these arms, they take advantage advantage of you and they do their own thing. But secondly, they don't deal with their own internal instability. What if the person we're negotiating with dies? What if there's an internal power struggle that makes them significantly more less democratic and significantly more authoritarian? These are things that are highly likely, especially in the non-democratic, violent nature that is in the rebel group, which likely suggests that for these rebel groups, not only do you make them worse, but even if you could pick the good ones, these ones are likely changing on an everyday basis, and they have the additional incentive to crack down on others. That is to suggest the hero, quote unquote, that they have on Gov is not actually a hero and that you make them worse. So even if they're 100% correct that they could do things like reform governments, get things like independence, their worst case is actually that they might be even more authoritarian than the regime that they've just replaced. Moreover, even if that regime is significantly more democratic, they have no response to the spillover effects. You fund arms in other countries once the conflict is over, and you generally make the world a less safe space. Thirdly, let's talk about the state. And here they have no analysis at all from Luigi. They just suggest that, well, potentially we will have victory on the other side, but they don't even have the probability analysis to suggest that these rebels will always win. Not only is this kind of mitigated by Naya analysis, which is to suggest that if these rebels are fragmented, have disparate goals, they're likely to lose. But secondly, the prerogative of a state changes massively. If you were a state right now and you're fighting partisan actions, the main thing that you can do is try to crack down on the amount of arms that are going to rebels. So regulating things like ports to make sure that even if there's agitations for liberty, it's not a violent agitation because they don't have the capacity to bear arms. When you introduce an exogenous factor, you have US Blackhawks that are dropping things like armaments, etc. to all of these people, you have no certainty to say whether or not there's actual rebels or militants within these areas because you're uncertain if these arms have already flowed in. This defaults to David's argument, to which we suggest that you have significantly greater degrees of oppression where you try to harass people on a mass basis because you have to rule on a certainty of fear because you lose all the individual military prowess that allows things like relatively safe peacekeeping operations even by authoritarian states. This ultimately suggests that not only do you destabilize the states, but in the vast majority of instances where you're unsuccessful because you can't reveal your intervention to the public, thus limiting the degree that you're allowed to intervene, you actually make these authoritarian states kill much less people in the road to peace. Fourthly, let's talk about this US government change. Actually, I'll kind of skip that just so we can go into best case analysis of Gov. Let's talk about this because their final case is to say, at the very least, we get some degree of authoritarian democracy and you don't really have any degree of change in order to make sure that the US intervention works. So I think the first thing that I'd like to highlight here is that we have a very strategic plan on op, which is to suggest if they want to burden push us, this whole idea that we're going to be very hesitant to intervene, at the very minimum, we have so many layers of analysis to suggest doing nothing is much better than doing something bad. So in the majority cases that they try to push on us, we're already winning. But secondly, in these individual cases, I would actually suggest this is how we prevent their worst harms. So I think the rationale is to suggest here that if your impetuses and reasons for invading of another country change, your causes and the sustainability of staying in that country change as well. So I think this is actually where we bias towards more of the Germany, Japan, Bosnia example. Wherein, if everyone is on the same page, we are invading this country because of X, Y, and Z human rights abuses, and we are engaging in a specific state building process, which is the only instances where you're confident and likely to engage, that you actually get the US staying for a long period of time, making sure that you develop a lot of degrees of democracy. Conversely, I would suggest that Gov fails in two ways. Not only does one, the historical funding of rebels prior to an invasion likely make that invasion significantly worse than staying because a lot of militancy gets developed. But secondly, to the extent at which you invade in that point, at which there is less of a degree of uncertainty because people are more confident, likely means it is more likely that you get spurious reasons for invading another country, i.e. they're more confident to invade for things like 9/11, etc. But on a final labor response, even if we had to accept this worst case, this is preferable to years of war. Even if we talk about the example of Iraq, the Iraq war lasted a total of 2 weeks because the US government was so militarily hegemonic against the local troops. The comparative that they're defending on Gov is if they're defending all of these local groups, this creates a massive sieges and a massive loss of life on a multi-decade basis to which they have no response for. With that, I'm proud to oppose.
All right, I thank the second negative speaker. I call upon the third affirmative speaker here.
Hi, I suppose I too should be able to give some shout outs, though I am certain I can give shout outs as well in the final when we advance. But of course, thanks so much to UPD for the support. Much love to our friends on the other side. And of course, I think the dream for me is not to go against Ateneo, but instead to go against the other team in the final. So they are still very happy to be here. So I will say that it is indeed a dream to be with very great people, a lot of people I respect in this call. Much love, that's all. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The trick on neg is saying that you can just opt to not intervene. The struggle with this is I do not think that is how the rules of debate work when you have to defend the opposition in the motion. But secondly, presumably you still opt in. Their worst case scenario, as we explained at first half, is never participating. Not never participating. What we explain is you will opt in at times, but you will hesitate and move out later on, and therefore you likely will have half-baked Western interventions. That is the comparative neither David nor Quintin actually explain, because under their side, they just assume that you have no intervention at all and allow this to happen. The reason why it's likely to be hesitant is because there is still a lot of political will to want to participate, right? The difference is when people now understand that there's such a large cost to it, and therefore they're likely to opt out because of the body bag effect, because of all the costs that are associated with it. Under negative, you are left with people reliant on the West, now susceptible to all local rebel groups that they do not have any capability to control. But second, even if we defend the world with some intervention versus no intervention, which I just absolutely do not think is a debate, do not believe in Quintin's lies, what first affirmative weighed is funding is more minimal in the effect. That is to say, even in the case where we have bad interventions that are more often, the scale of interventions on their side that are military, that you allow peacekeeping forces in to potentially abuse individuals, that you portray that you are the savior of the world, allows you, A, to ensure that there's greater forms of anti-Western sentiment that exists, because now people actually see your guns, your tanks there being held by white soldiers. But secondly, on their side, it actively hurts everyone, because now all other local rebel groups actually coalesce against you. That means that potentially they have less. That doesn't mean they're more accountable. That doesn't mean that these are better. You just mean that you are able to coalesce, you still have the same scale of harm. Two things in this speech. Firstly, will you actually fund the right rebel groups, dealing with the first path to victory that negative asserts? Secondly, will this actually be held accountable? The second path to victory that unfortunately they do not actually prove. Firstly, will the funding go to the right groups? And what neg gives is two assertions from first neg. The first is that governments want to give it to radical groups because they're most likely to work. And secondly, that they want attention and use violence. 5 responses. First, US interventions often, US have many incentives in picking the right rebel group under our side, because they want to choose the one that aligns closest with them, because they know that they have sufficient funding to let the less radical but more ideologically consistent group win. Like, evidently, if they are so violent, the US is aware they'll start to be belligerent. It's most likely they will not give funds. What second negative intuits here is, if the US knows everything, then why are we still going into conflict? Like, I don't give a shit. Like, I think the USA is the largest military capability in the world. I do think they are capable of being able to predict a lot of these things, and that is why historically, in the majority of cases, you are able to fund good local groups. But secondly, even when the US doesn't have complete information about this, and this is the second response, the US is able to put them off or take them out, right? That's why we make rebel groups beholden and reliant on the state. They say that, well, you're going to be able to walk away with the training. I don't think that's likely for two key reasons. A, they don't want to piss off the Western state that feeds them, even when they win, because they are ultimately reliant on the Western state to give them funding, give them soft power protection in the United Nations Security Council, give them protection economically as well. Under our side, they cannot cut off the West easily, because the West is the one who provided them that support at all. And that means even when they turn belligerent, it's likely to weaken the local rebel group very strongly. But secondly, even when they are consistently changing, and that is the second assertion we get coming from second negative, I think it's perfectly fine, because regardless, like, I do think that the West bodies are the local rebel groups. But secondly, and sub response, these rebels will need more continuous funding in the long run, and so we have a lot of influence in the behavior of these rebel groups as well. That's why I don't think they're likely to constantly shift, because the US is able to ensure that they are consistent and is able to give them intel to be able to beat out other local groups who do not have the same capability as the West. Even when they turn to Russia or China, oftentimes these are insufficient because they have weaker intel, but also don't have the military and economic capability of the states. But thirdly, and last response under this, even if we don't know what the rebel groups will do, then the self-preserving incentives of rebel groups are far better than the incentives of authoritarian governments to directly kick out the US government in the long run. That means that on their side, when you do succeed and you are no longer dependent on the United States, you will likely kick out the US government, and that is where you'll still be rolled, or or still be held by a belligerent local group. What do these two major responses do to the neg case? It means potentially you do not know where the funding goes. Potentially the funding is going to terrible groups. The problem is these terrible groups also still exist under their side, and therefore not picking them only makes them angry, makes them more likely to coalesce, but secondly as well, more likely to attack the United States as well as have greater forms of collateral damage. The third response I want to point out is even if they're bad, notably under our side, at the very least, like authoritarian rebel groups are easier to cooperate with because they are beholden to the US government for more funding, which is the extension we get coming from second negative that doesn't get a second affirmative that doesn't get a sufficient response. At the end of all of this, therefore, I think it's probably likely they're going to choose the right groups. Even if they don't, why is it that we get quicker resolutions? And at this point, we already explained why it'll likely be good. Their claim here is that you're likely to not be as accountable because it's going to be hidden. So this is a slight tension because at first neg they say that, well, you're still going to be able to use anti-Western sentiment. If it's obscured, I don't think there's going to be anti-Western sentiment under affirmative. But more crucially, firstly, the problem with affirmative is you assume you can hold the US accountable. So if you do intervene, I don't think it's very likely that just because you have less is often better. Oftentimes the US is still able to have a lot of influence within hard power in a lot of societies, and that's why it's very unlikely they're going to be scrutinized very well, very successfully, and therefore you allow harmful people to still be able to hold to be in power, even if it's far less. The comparative is you have internal incentives as well as the United States to do funding a lot better because these are things that you don't want to actually lose and you hold yourself accountable to this. And that means the incentive is asymmetric because under our side, you have incentives to do it well because these are things that don't that are not super pressuring on you, but also you don't give them so much power, and that's why secondly, even if there are bad interventions that potentially are more often, the effect is less. They claim that there is collateral damage that exists under our side. I would say that's untrue. Under their side, when it's military intervention, you're far less likely to be targeted, firstly because you are having coups, you're having military groups, you incentivize and ensure that the borders of these regions are often very, very tense. That means that under their side, there's far more collateral damage because there is a presence of a Western state, material from first affirmative that never gets a response, and that's why you have far more proxy wars that exist, and that's why it's far lengthened. But even if there are no proxy wars and under our side we potentially have more common interventions, the scale of it is less. Like in the worst case scenario where you do fund rebel groups, when you pull out of these rebel groups, it's perfectly okay because now they're going to be far more beholden to you, and they're going to be like more scrambled. It's easier to hold, it's easier to know about them because you are getting the information about them as well. It's easier to crack down on them, but secondly as well, it's easier to destabilize. Like the harm of a local rebel group collapsing when you do not have funds is far better than the harm of an entire state collapsing because the US pulls out of it, a la Afghanistan. In many instances under affirmative's best case scenario where you do succeed in your military intervention and the country itself becomes ultimately dependent on the Western state, the problem is under their side, you are never able to ensure that the Western state is always going to be there. That means under their side, when the Western state hesitates, even if it is just one single intervention, when they inevitably pull out, because most white people probably support it when they see body bags effects, when it comes in Africa or whatever, that likely means under their side, there is increased conflict when there is a power vacuum that we do not have because under our side, we're able to pick rebel groups and be able to utilize the influence of the United States. But second, in the absence of a power vacuum, their world is a world where people often die because they are susceptible in the absence of funding. For these reasons, affirmative advances.
All right, I thank the third affirmative speaker. I call upon the third negative speaker to end the substantive part of the debate.
Sorry. Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Stop it. Stop talking to me. Yes, stop talking to me. Quintin, I'm gonna use your phone.
Okay.
Quintin, unlock your phone, please.
Well,
Oh, okay. Thanks. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There's a part of me that doesn't understand what affirmative wants us to do because we were very charitable in complying with the first thing that they launched at first speaker. Affirmative said that we would likely intervene less because there are so many bureaucratic structures that prevent military from being able to enter into the countries, and we defend it. Then at whip they go, they can't say that they are intervening less. because they have to defend this military intervention. But at the same time, we still time and again defend that a hesitant intervention still go on our side, because at the very least, it is accountable. When they leave, there are no proxy wars, despite affirmative choosing time and again to be uncharitable to what my previous two speakers have talked about. And this really shows when their analysis and talking about how they say that the collateral damage on small on-site affirmative when you fund local rebel groups, because the intervention is small, but they also ignore the fact that rebel groups often multiply. And their response and their solution to this is like in a Pokemon battle where we say, we don't choose you anymore. We either number one, go up to the UN and say, hey, that's not our rebel group anymore because they've gone rogue. Or number two, their other solution is to fund another rebel group and hope that they don't go rogue and they follow their solutions. Obviously, they need to respond to both of these, because right now it looks like side affirmative is just running around with no real solution as to what they would have, assuming the worst case scenarios happen, right? They talk about how pulling out of a country is hard, yet despite that, talk about how pulling out a rebel group is so easy after you've already give them all the guns, ammunition, the intel, and you already beholden them for these types of things. Stands for themselves. I think that is clear the reason why affirmative, just like margins are huge, right? There are two things I'm going to talk about then to clearly solidify the win for side negative. The first is, where do we have a better calculus to entering into these interventions? And the second I want to talk about is the aftermath. So peace facilitation, being able to pull out, etc., etc. First, in terms of the calculus for entering into interventions to begin with, the first thing I want to talk about is what affirmative talked about. So they gave two things. The first is that we would have all the information and all the intelligence to decide which rebel group we would fund, and that's a good thing. The second thing they talked about is we would likely choose the winner. So whoever rebel group has the highest propensity to be successful in this scenario. But here's the thing, even if we believe this to the best extent, it's a question of whether or not you actually have the capacity to control these groups, right? Even if you can choose initially, can't choose what happens when the orb's already in the country, when you can't just like have all cameras on all the rebel groups to decide whether or not they are using these weapons and these ammunitions in the proper way, right? Their response to why we can hold these rebel groups accountable on their side is because if the West retracts, these rebel groups obviously will lose their power, and that is the reason why rebel groups have a high incentive to comply with, I don't know, human rights or whatever the West would want. There are a few things I want to respond to this. The first is, they already have your guns, right? They just have to refill the bullets. I don't understand why you need the constant support from the West after they've already given you everything they want at the very beginning. The second is, I think that the difference is you are beholden to these rebel groups on the side of affirmative. You rely on them for intelligence. You rely on them to be able to tell you what's going on the ground. And that is why at the point in time that you threaten to retract information, or at any point in time these rebel groups just decide that they want to lie to you, that is the point in time where your information is no longer inaccurate, etc., etc. And you can't even tell what is going on, right? Even if we can retract support, the problem is that it is very difficult to understand when we should retract support, because rebel groups often do the extremely grotesque crimes without us knowing. So even at the point in time that they choose retract support on the side of affirmative, this would have already happened after all of the most egregious, most terrible war crimes have already been committed by these rebel groups. And that is why even if there are means for them to be able to pull out and retract their support, that is already when all of the most terrible harms have happened. Eventually, they even try to say that, well, the rebel groups will choose to overthrow the Western government on our side. But I also want to point out how this is extremely symmetric on their side, insofar as when the rebel groups just decide that they no longer need these Western institutions anymore, it's just very easy for them to let go because they have no longer any incentive to comply with them. They have everything they want, etc., etc. What did we say then on side negative? So here's the thing. We gave you so many reasons as to why the militaries would likely act in a more judicious manner. The first is the state is just highly accountable, right? Insofar as you can get voted out of power. You probably don't want that to happen. And so you would choose to enter into wars where you have a good chance of winning, where you understand that you probably won't commit any terrible crimes because you don't want any backlash from the populace on the ground. The second is, I also think it's for the reasons they give. Like, for example, you probably don't want to randomly send soldiers on a proper strategy. Otherwise, you get the millions of body bags that often deflect people from wanting to intervene and help out in other places anyway, or want to fund the military to begin with. Thirdly, you also don't want to expend unnecessary funding. And lastly, they don't want to be blamed for the worsening of these wars, especially because the difference is that if it is military intervention, you can actively trace this back to your own action as opposed to scapegoating it on some other rebel group and what they've done. What does this mean? I think, the first thing is, there are exclusive strategies only states can do. So, for example, you can't teach a rebel group how to use drones, how to use smart artificial intelligence in warfare because they don't have the infrastructure, these are military secrets, but you can do that for states. And that is good because it means we are more precise in the manners we choose to target, let's say, the heads of terrorist organizations, right? And also, as opposed to just sending boots on the ground when it is rebel groups. The second thing is, in many cases, it is multiple countries choosing to intervene together, right? So in the examples we give, like the UN mission in Somalia, it wasn't just one state unilaterally deciding to enter and also the timer died. It was multiple states who were able to hold each other accountable to ensure that they were able to commit these in a way that was as humane and as good as possible, right? I also think that even if you don't believe that we are good on the warfare aspect, there are so many other things we defend in terms of military intervention that you can only get when a state who intervenes. The first is the idea that we have more capacity to do things like send aid and donations on the ground when we have our own soldiers going into that country, because we are certain our soldiers will not try to keep that food for themselves or give it to their other rebel group friends, right? As opposed to if it is a rebel group, we don't understand whether, and we are not certain whether or not it is true they will really distribute this to the people on the ground, or whether they would distribute these to the people on the ground without any strings attached, right? The second thing is, we also talked about how at the very least, we are better off for the dissidents on this country, right? That is to say that the harm on the side of affirmative is, if you have Western funding, it is so easy for the state to label whoever is a dissident as someone being funded by the West, and therefore radicalize the crackdowns on people and crackdowns on dissidents. At the very least, political dissidents, people who don't want to necessarily be involved in rebel groups, are far safer when we remove this attack that you could have on them on side affirmative, right? That's why, in terms of the incentives, we are clearly far more accountable and clearly better off. The next thing I want to talk about is just on the aftermath, and why, even after all of this, we would likely be the ones to facilitate peace. The first is, again, bringing up the problem with rebel groups is that they often have a multiplier effect, right? And oftentimes, rebel groups who take power become rogue state. They take your arms, they use it to overthrow the government, and then eventually, they become the government that they want to take down in the first place. Even if rebel groups are benevolent, we had analysis say that funding rebel groups as Western nations catalyzes other nations to also have their own funds, meaning you make rebel groups dramatically opposed to each other due to conflicting benefactors if other rebel groups are, let's say, funded by China or Russia, etc., etc. The last thing is, I also want to point out is that affirmative had a very hybrid this debate. They had to prove, and they had the obligation to prove, that this new government would be better than the last, and also coupled with the fact that the years of war were justified. In certainty, we proved to you that regardless of whether or not we win, the point is side affirmative prolongs this war to an astronomical extent in the vast majority of instances. And at that point in time, it is so much more difficult to control the amount of human suffering. It is so much more difficult to pull out because you don't have control over these weapons anymore. And that is why it is simply far more better, far more accountable, and far more humane that we allow and we make it so that states are the ones who do this. For all of these reasons, oppose.
All right, I thank the third negative speaker. I call upon the third, the negative reply speaker. Here.
Hello, can I be heard? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. They always say reply is a biased adjudication, so I'm going to approach this like how I would if I were a judge. The first thing that stands out to me is there's a very large argument on op that Gov doesn't respond to, which is states become more violent against their civilians. If we are unsure, because for some reason or another there's a deadlock about how rebel groups will act, specifically the ones you will fund, then we give you very good reasons for why the violence unilaterally increases, because the largest and most proximate source of violence gets much more unfriendly towards civilians on the ground because they're more willing to target them. This is an argument coming from LO, impacted further at DLO, and it shows that if you believe none of the outcomes that Gov and op contend on resolve, then you can believe that the one outstanding thing is that state actors get substantially worse and are the most proximate actors and also just destroy the quality of life for many civilians. We give you many mechanisms from this, such as, for example, losing out on access to international aid, like, for example, using specifically gas and chemical warfare on your own civilians, like what happened in their example in government of Syria. So the first thing is we have a standing argument that Gov doesn't have a response to. The second thing is Gov says this point that the public can be motivated by bad things, which one contradicts their own analysis, because their own analysis is that the public tends to be squeamish about committing war crimes. And also, it's not just the public, it's also the international community that is very, very angry at, you committing many of these war crimes. And the public wants to end the war fast. Presumably, as we said before, committing war crimes makes the war take much longer because people are more radicalized against you. This is their only response in terms of content to whether or not the interventions get worse or better because of the incentives behind them. We showed to you that there is some strong reasons for why, if it's just the politicians and the state alone choosing to intervene, then the specific interventions they will do will not be to build peace. This is the prerequisite analysis for Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister's arguments, which says that eventually you'll be able to build peace, which is we show if that is not your objective, you will never build peace because the intent is to sell arms and delegitimize the state and protect your own oil fields. We said this was impossible to happen in opposition. One, for the reasons they give on government, that these institutions are more hesitant, they're more liable to listen to what civilians on the ground think, and there are two, many more democratic checks and balances on the ground, and three, we have much more control. Even if they do pull out, at least arms aren't being sent around to various rebel groups that may be themselves terrorists. So we showed that number one, in the instance of failure, which is much less likely on our side, at the very least, it's better. But I want to point out, they haven't answered a very important question. Win? Because note, if they're losing or if they continue to lose, but they increase the net amount of arms and they make the war much last longer, maybe you can shake your head, you haven't proven at all. And we clearly showed you that they lose this debate because they failed to prove that they can successfully remove the authoritarian regime and they only make it worse. What we show is that the very high propensity that if we do intervene, it will be much better and that the resulting state would be much more accountable, both the international regime and in terms of success. They say, oh, but people will get mad because of anti-Western sentiment, which is a last-ditch response at government whip to show, oh, at some point, our authoritarian state might get more challenged than their authoritarian state. But what we show is that many of the incentives to challenge this are symmetric because people will also point out that the rebel-held government is itself funded by the West. But the comparative in opposition is that it's much more militarily powerful, so it resists these attempts much stronger. It's much more liable to attract investment. They say there's some uncertainty stuff, which is Luigi's extension, but we show very clearly that the uncertainty on the level of will these states pull out is much less for investors than the uncertainty of are the guys you're funding actual freaking terrorists, right? The final thing I want to point out is accountability measure. So we win it clearly, but they lose. And this is the basic reason that they don't actually have a tooth, right, to be able to fight back these people that you're funding. They say at best, you attract soft power from the UN, which has never been the concern of like any organization ever. And it's been shown time and time again that once you hand over funds to the Mujahideen, once you hand over funds to the rebel groups in these areas, you no longer know what's going on. So maybe everything they say is true. There's still like a 50% chance, a 60% chance they send in and it becomes another Taliban. There's a 60% chance, a 70% chance it eventually becomes another terrorist group. We are sure that if we are committing bad, we can pull out. They are never sure, which is why it's almost impossible to weigh any of their benefits. And even if they were sure, the scale of it would not be able to build long-term peace. It would cause the war to be much longer and cause the authoritarian state to be itself much worse. On about each and every contention, government has lost this debate.
Thank you, negative reply. To close the entire debate, I call upon the affirmative reply. Be here.
Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. Luigi Hiamde, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. In a very short phrase, we win because we've proven that there are simply more ways for a direct military intervention to go wrong or to fail to meet their own standards of success. So I'm going to go through each and every one of these scenarios that they attempted to defend in their case. Number one, they said that the intervention can be quick and clean and well justified. We did not contest that the US military will be effective at using its missiles and its tanks and its troops. And what we did say is that the decision-making process of pulling them out or keeping them in across US administrations, or even the process of multilateral interventions having many countries, causes too much lag and uncertainty that erodes any functional governance in the short to medium term during the crisis or in the long run during the transition. And I want to compare this against the rebels who we characterized, and they agreed to be committed to this conflict and have clear objectives to follow through over the years. The previous speaker's response was to say that, oh no, we can pull out compared to the uncertainty of a terrorist organization being funded by our regime. The totality and the scale of pulling out or making that decision is exactly what makes their policy much harder to be able to justify, and that the disruption from the military is just worse because of its total all-encompassing nature and the prioritization to keep US soldiers alive over any other outcome. On the comparative, the self-preserving interests of a single rebel group are more concentrated, more targeted, and for the specific outcomes of that rebel group, and are more likely geared towards increasing recruitment to the end goal of leading the new regime as part of a revolution. So even if they're self-interested, we agree that these revolutions may sometimes be bloody and they might take out opposition groups, but it's a clear path towards a stable government or a functional government compared to the alternative. We are funding groups so that they can increase their chances of winning, and so that we can have more influence within these regimes in the long run, and that is better than giving into the complete rebel free-for-all that it comes along with the direct military intervention by accusing government agencies and other rebels as all being part of the enemy too. Because drone strikes also kill different rebel groups. Drone strikes also kill your military soldiers from the existing regime. Also divides those rebel groups against one another. Also creates more power vacuums. We would rather pick winners. Number two, they said that intervention allows us to avoid empowering a very bad rebel group. And bad rebel groups can still take over, even with direct military intervention. Because in my speech, I explained that you either create fake democracies or you create significantly anti-Western governments that will willingly take funding from China and Russia and therefore become harder to cooperate with. What's the outcome? You have less stable and more uncertainty in how the future regimes will behave. Their response was that, oh no, we can't control the behavior of a rebel group. But at worst, picking a winner makes it easier for us to influence these regimes or avoid the worst excesses of no influence at all, because we don't threaten those existing regimes with military intervention. Their response was to say that we have to fund multiple rebel groups because we don't know and will be uncertain. But this is a late response from the third. But more than this, our competition mechanism that we said in our speeches is the exact reason why rebel groups will favor us and be beholden to us rather than joining any other institution. So this multiplying impact is actually worse on their model when direct military interventions also put rebel groups in the crossfires a lot of the time during the ensuing power vacuum in your intervention. They said that they can do nothing and not enter in at all. And our most charitable interpretation of this is that you are more in control of the military and that you may choose not to intervene rather than a rebel who might be uncooperative. This is exactly the over-reliance on US military governance and on the post-democratic transitions that are ushered in that are imperfect by those US military democracies that lead to failed power sharing agreements, that lead to failed trust on these government institutions. That is why I argued it is perfectly fine to have an authoritarian rebel government that is more beholden to US military funders or the US aid or all of these different institutions, because the uncertainty of a US military intervention already halts governments or keeps them in a totally crisis-stricken state wherein any regime may attempt to kick them out. So at worst, we argued that stability and authoritarianism is better tempered in a model wherein we fund rebel groups rather than rely on the US military government to fulfill its dream.
All right, I think that's affirmative reply speaker. That's also the end of the debate. Thank you, everyone. We will announce the results on Discord, I believe. So permission to stop the live stream. Just checking, Rob, are we going to use the Zoom call for deliberation?
Thanks for the round.